On Baywatch, what happens when a murder...
Saturday on Channel 5 News at 10. Is there a job you really want but shyness prevents you from applying? Does shyness interfere with your desire to meet someone special?
I feel very inhibited and extremely lonely.
Dr. Barry Kaufman visits the first clinic devoted to what experts call a social disease, shyness hiding out from life, Saturday at 10.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States.
The United States of America will not yield to international terrorism or to blackmail.
They came in and they took all of us, blindfolded us, tied our hands behind our backs, and they took us.
Will you release the hostages, and when will you release them?
For 444 days, these were the images that paraded across our television screens and burned themselves into our consciousness. It was the time when America was held hostage, an event that restructured our political landscape and to a large extent reshaped our lives. It began 10 years ago.
This is a special edition of ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
If you were not exactly tuned into the news in those days, if you were living in an East Bloc country, for example, or if you were 11 years old and adjusting to life in the 5th grade, you can't begin to understand what a huge story it was. For one thing, we were convinced since the early 1950s, when the CIA helped the young Shah to the throne of Iran, we were convinced that U.S. and Iranian interests were all but identical. In fact, during the early 1970s, when Washington was still obsessed with events in Indochina, and when the OPEC countries imposed an oil embargo in order to drive oil prices up, it was Iran and the Shah to whom the United States turned to keep selling us oil and to protect U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf. For both reasons, because we needed all that oil and because we wanted Iran to be our military surrogate in the Persian Gulf, the United States sold billions of dollars worth of sophisticated weapons to the Shah. Our military worked hand in glove with his military. Our Central Intelligence Agency maintained a warm, collegial relationship with his secret police, Savak. When there were reports of internal dissent in Iran and then corollary reports of human rights abuses, Savak told the CIA that the dissenters were communists, that the stories of human rights abuse were propaganda. And Washington didn't push very hard to verify those stories. In fact, on New Year's Eve, as 1977 gave way to 1978, President Jimmy Carter was in Tehran toasting the health and the stability of the Shah and his government.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
In point of fact, the Shah was not healthy. He was dying of cancer, and his government was not stable. It was about to be toppled by an exile, a stony-faced, near-mystical cleric living on the outskirts of Paris. Within a matter of months, this man, the Ayatollah Khomeini, ended his own exile, arriving back in Iran just 2 weeks after the Shah Reza Pahlavi went into exile himself. And the cozy relationship between Tehran and Washington came to an end. And then, on October 22nd, 1979, the Shah, desperately needing sophisticated medical attention, came to the United States. And in Iran, it was as though a giant boil had burst. What followed almost immediately was to become, for the President of the United States, the greatest ordeal of his term in office. And joining us now from Atlanta, the man who was then President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Mr. President, that famous toast of yours on New Year's Eve, 77 to 78, where you referred to the Shah in Iran as being this island of stability in a sea of trouble, did you know better at the time, and was that just a diplomatic thing to do, or why did you say that?
Well, the Shah had dealt with 7 or 8 presidents at that time, and I think it was accurate to say that Iran was an island of stability as far as we knew it then. I had met with the Shah briefly in Washington about a month before that. I pointed out that he had serious troubles at home. He assured me there was just a tiny number of people, they were all communists and so forth. So I think I was expressing an opinion then that was shared by, so far as I know, every leader, every security organization, every intelligence organization in the Western world.
How surprised were you when, really, only a few months later, the Shah was forced to flee his own country?
Well, at the time he was forced to flee, it wasn't a surprise because we had seen the buildup of it. We gave the Shah every support that we could, urging him to bring democracy and to his country. But the Shah was always, you might say, a day late and a dollar short. He did some good things, putting good people in as prime minister on occasion, but he never gave them quite enough authority, quite enough responsibility to let the people know that the Shah was sincere.
With the benefit of hindsight now, Mr. President, should you have been, A, tougher on the Shah in terms of trying to force him into making accommodations with some of his opponents, or B, perhaps tougher on the opponents and just said, look, he may be, as someone else said later on, a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch?
We tried to get the Shah to honor the basic principles of democracy and human rights, which he was inclined to do in the last few months under intense pressure, and to bring about a realization among the Iranian people that the Shah could survive, but that some form of democratic government would have to be instituted where the people would have a right to choose their own prime minister, their own cabinet members, and their own parliament. The Shah was never quite willing to do that until it was too late.
There is one other great question in the hindsight variety that now comes as we approach in this program now the taking of the hostages, and that was the decision that you ultimately made to permit the Shah, who was gravely ill at that time, to come to the United States and receive medical attention. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, would you have done it any differently?
Well, I was one of the last ones, I think, in the whole administration that was willing to let the Shah come in. I was convinced by personal importunities from the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, the doctors who had examined the Shah, that the only chance that he had to extend his life was to come to New York for treatment. And before he came, I notified the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of Iran, with whom we were working quite harmoniously, that this would take place. They promised me, both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister, they would protect our people, provided the Shah did not participate in any sort of political activities or make political statements while he was in the United States. With that arrangement, then, we let the Shah come in. And they were determined to honor that commitment. After the students took the Shah and took the embassy, captured our people, for 2 or 3 days, I think even the Ayatollah Khomeini was in doubt about what to do. Then his son went to the embassy, and it became obvious that it was a popular thing to do. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, Bazagan and Yazdi, resigned in protest against this violation of a commitment that they had made to us that our embassy would be protected.
But again, and just very quickly, if you would, my question was, given the benefit of hindsight, would you have done it any differently? Ultimately, you made the decision to let him in. Ultimately, it was the President's decision. I
think it was the right decision. If I had known that the hostages would be taken and so forth, I certainly may have had second thoughts, but that was an impossibility. The main thing that I had to address after the hostages were taken was 2 things. One is to protect the lives and the safety of every hostage and bring each one back to safety. At the same time, to protect the honor and the integrity and the interest of my country. Although it took a lot longer than I had wanted to, I think we succeeded in both cases.
Mr. President, we're going to move on now, and when we come back, we'll see what happened during those 444 days of captivity.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by MCI.
Sunday on David Brinkley, the 89 vote, the critical issues, the mudslinging, and the chances for America's first black governor. Sunday at a special time.
We'll be continuing our conversation with former President Carter a little later, but first, a quick refresher on some of the highlights during that 444 days that the hostages were held. Here's Nightline correspondent James Walker.
It was on a Sunday night in November 1979 that many Americans first learned about the incident in Tehran that would become a national obsession.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner.
The next day, the Ayatollah sent his son Ahmed to the embassy as a demonstration of support for the students. That night, they burned the American flag and delivered their battle cry, "Give us the Shah, and we will free the hostages."
In answer to the question, are we considering handing him over, or are there any plans to do so or to meet that demand? The answer is no.
The Shah was in a New York City hospital because President Jimmy Carter, acting at the urging of the Shah's longtime friends Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, allowed him to enter the U.S. for treatment of cancer. In Tehran, Khomeini's supporters saw that as a CIA conspiracy to return the Shah to his throne, just as the U.S. had done 26 years earlier. On the third day of the embassy takeover, the students warned the U.S. not to intervene militarily.
In case the United States decides to do something like Entebbe airport, as the Israelis did it in Uganda, if they want to do something like this, to release these hostages, you must be sure that they will definitely be killed.
That same day, Khomeini effectively forced Iranian Prime Minister Bazargan, considered a friend of the West, to step down. Khomeini turned over power to a group called the Revolutionary Council. U.S. officials felt they were now dealing with a phantom government. To Americans, the pictures from Iran were not reassuring. Tens of thousands of angry protesters converged daily on the U.S. Embassy, shouting, "Death to America, death to Carter." In this chaos, the students kept center stage, parading another of the hostages for the world to see. In Washington, President Carter said the U.S. would not buckle under to Iranian threats.
Ours is not a country that responds or ever will respond to intimidation or blackmail.
To intensify the pressure, Carter imposed economic sanctions, halting oil imports from Iran and freezing billions of dollars of Iranian assets held in U.S. banks. Ayatollah Khomeini then raised the stakes, charging the hostages were spies, and the U.S., the great Satan, was impotent.
Carter tries to frighten us on the economic front. He does not have the military courage to attack us. Victory will belong to the people who are sitting on waves of oil.
The repeated threats were mixed with moments of hope.
We do know we're leaving.
The Iranians released 13 hostages, 8 black men and 5 women, in time to go home for Thanksgiving. 2 weeks later, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to urge Iran to give up the hostages. But the Iranians ignored the UN, just as it ignored every international attempt to resolve the crisis. Christmas 1979, day 52. The students scored a public relations coup. They allowed 3 U.S. clergymen to visit the hostages, then released these pictures which tugged at the heartstrings of an America that could do nothing but watch. The frustration of the hostages was matched by the frustration of their families. On day 142 of the embassy takeover, Dorothea Moorfield, wife of hostage Richard Moorfield, appeared on Nightline and confronted Iranian diplomat Ali Agha.
How can you continue to hold these innocent people?
Well, Mrs. Moorfield, how could you remain silent in the past 27 years when your government was involved in torturing, killing, and doing all kinds of corrupt action against our people?
We tried, we failed, and we have paid a price. The bodies of 8 young Americans still lie in the Iranian desert, victims of the tragic end to a daring and dangerous attempt to rescue the hostages in Tehran.
In July, one obstacle to the release of the hostages was removed when the Shah died in Egypt. But Tehran's intransigence did not waver. Iran was at war with Iraq. It desperately needed weapons and supplies. But the hostage crisis had isolated Iran from much of the world. If the hostage issue had become a handicap for the Iranians, it had also become an insurmountable handicap for Jimmy Carter's re-election bid. But even in defeat, he continued to press for negotiations. Finally, a deal was worked out. It included the return of $8 billion in Iranian assets.
The money's in the bank. Our action is complete. Iran's being notified through Algeria that the money's there. That's all you need to tell them.
Day 444.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
30 minutes after Ronald Reagan became president, Iran freed the 52 hostages. I'm James Walker for Nightline.
When we return, we'll go back to former President Carter and to a question that's been whispered about for years. Did Republicans try to make a deal for the hostages behind his back?
Monday, time on the job could cost you your job. Age discrimination, the price we all pay when business places too little value on experience.
I really feel like I have an awful lot to offer.
Finally, an organization that helps not-so-old workers get jobs and feel good. Watch Peter Jennings on ABC's World News Tonight, Monday.
Here President Carter was in the waning hours and minutes of his administration, not even having time to reflect on his presidency or his last hours in the White House or his last several hours at his desk, but waiting and listening and talking and prodding to try to have this agreement consummated by the time he left office.
Right on, man. That's great. That's great.
As Ham Jordan said, these were the hours during which normally, if you hadn't been asleep, you would have been able to reflect on your presidency. And as you look back on that now, why was it so important to you that those hostages be returned during those last few hours?
Well, after the election was over, and I knew that I would not have a second term, we tried to inform President Reagan and his Secretary of State-elect, who was Mr. Haig, John Haig, about the hostage situation. They refused even to be briefed on the subject. So it became very apparent to me and to all those who worked with me that if we didn't get the hostages out before we left office, that it was highly unlikely that within the next number of months a successful effort might be made to accomplish that goal. I didn't even go to bed between Saturday night and Tuesday when the inauguration took place. We were negotiating in perhaps one of the most complicated international political arrangements that had ever been seen. We were talking about $12 billion, a number of nations involved in 3 different languages. Our chief negotiator was in a foreign country, in Algiers. And we were negotiating with a man who up to then had been totally irresponsible, had refused even to talk to an American. We were successful at the last minute. On Tuesday morning of Inauguration Day, we knew that all the hostages were loaded into the airplane, that the airplane was sitting on the end of the runway, ready to take off. And as I left for inauguration ceremonies, I breathed a sigh of relief knowing that our negotiations had been successful. They left the airport just a few minutes after I was no longer president. And I can say that in spite of the fact that I turned over the reins of a great nation as president to my successor, it was one of the happiest moments, one of the happiest days of my life.
At which point, Mr. President, did you become aware of, and I'm sort of exaggerating a little bit, that there were Iranians in the United States and Iranians back in Tehran and in Algiers quite literally standing there with walkie-talkies saying, Carter's not out yet, don't let him go just yet? At which point did you realize that there was a conscious effort on their part not to let the hostages go while you were still officially president?
Well, it was a lot later before that conjecture, that analysis became prevalent. Warren Christopher, the Deputy Secretary of State, was in Algiers, and he had informed me quite early that morning that all the negotiations were over, that a total agreement has been reached between me and the Ayatollah, between Americans and Iranians, that the hostages were transported to the airport, they would take off momentarily. We really expected them to take off when they got there, about 10 o'clock that morning. And of course, I didn't know what was going on, except that we were waiting for the word that they had cleared Iranian airspace so that they could be announced. I never have understood and never have tried to understand why the Ayatollah refused to let the plane depart until after I left office. Whether it was just a personal animosity toward me or something else, I've never understood.
Well, I'd like you to listen now, if you would, to an interview that we did with the man who used to be your chief Iranian advisor on the National Security Council, Navy Captain Gary Sick.
Richard Nixon went off to London and discussed an independent rescue mission with a British helicopter manufacturer and a group of retired British commandos, that they were going to put together an independent rescue mission. After the Nixon contact in London, there were reportedly a series of meetings in September and October, building up to a sort of crescendo in the 19th and 20th of October in Europe, in which it's alleged that people affiliated with the Republican campaign met with Israelis and Iranians, among others, and supposedly to work out some kind of a deal about the hostages. The other thing was the magnitude of the arms shipments to Iran that began from Israel immediately after the Reagan administration came in. The quantities were really very substantial, and what I've now learned from several very reliable sources is that it was not just a wink and a nod on the part of the American government, but in fact the Israelis provided lists of weapons to the United States for approval at each stage along the way. And the fact that the Reagan administration would come in and as one of its first actions approve really very substantial arms deliveries to Iran, apparently without asking any questions, strikes me as very strange indeed.
Yes. Put that together for a moment with what you told me a little bit earlier in this segment, namely that representatives of the Reagan administration didn't even want to be briefed on what was going on in the negotiations. Have you ever had any kind of suspicion up to and including this moment that there was some kind of a deal that had been struck between the Reagan administration or the Republican Party and the Iranians?
Yes, I've had suspicions, but I don't have any evidence, and I've never sought any evidence. President Bani Sadr, who was a leader of Iran then working under the Ayatollah Khomeini, has made public statements on several occasions to responsible news reporters that there was a deal made. I've never tried to find out if this allegation is true. As I agree with Gary Sick, who's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about the entire incident, that it is mind-boggling just to think about, American leaders at a time of crisis for our country when the lives of the hostages were at stake and when their safety was preeminent, to be doing anything that would subvert the efforts of their own government. I might say that the things that we attempted in the White House were shared as within the maximum boundaries with both President Ford and President Nixon. So they were privy to what we were doing, and if things were going on behind the back of American officials by which we were not familiar, then that is strange indeed. I still don't know the truth of the allegations.
And when we come back, Nightline's Jeff Greenfield looks at the impact of what was most certainly one of our longest-running media events. It was debated then, it is still being debated now, the impact of putting television and terrorism together. Here's Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
You have seen these images dozens, maybe hundreds of times. And therein lies a tale of crisis in an age of mass media.
Because what happened a decade ago did not simply happen at an embassy in Tehran, it happened here, on television, on tens of millions of screens, night after night. And the questions raised by that fact remain with us to this day.
he was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates.
Did the television cameras, did the ability to transmit dramatic pictures around the world at the speed of light exaggerate the story, making of it more than it was?
They didn't have a choice. I think they really had to treat it as a major story. They did not have to saturate it and overkill the story the way they did.
Yet look at all the forces combining to encourage massive coverage. The Iranian militants were out to prove a point to the world and to the people inside Iran. The networks, this one in particular, recognized an emotionally riveting tale and a chance to do what it had wanted to do in the field of news for some time.
When the hostage crisis occurred, we started doing specials every night for a short period of time, thinking it might be 2 weeks. It actually turned out to be 444 days, but in the process, having made that pledge, we then took an ad telling the public that, and we were committed. But it also proved that after the life or death aspect of the crisis had subsided somewhat, and we had to just make interesting programs about issues that people continued to watch.
And the American administration had its interests as well.
And on the top of the great Christmas tree is a star of hope. We will turn on the other lights on the tree when the American hostages come home.
For the Carter administration, policy and politics fused together behind one key goal: keep the hostages front and center.
If the administration had not been a willing participant in this elevation of a terrible story into a national obsession, the media could not have stood with it.
And what of the outpouring of emotion here at home? The yellow ribbons, the surge of empathy in which we could literally see firsthand the anguish of the hostages' families.
Clearly, the coverage kept the hostages at the center of our concern. But what if wider foreign policy interests had demanded that those hostages be put at risk, perhaps to teach terrorists that they could not get away with such tactics in the future? Did TV, in effect, tie the hands of government decision-makers by making the hostages' safety so critically important to all of us?
To the extent that the saturation coverage of this by television put the heat on the president always to be thinking constantly of the lives of the diplomats that were involved, I suppose one could argue that to that extent he was more restrained in any kind of a rescue mission or military action.
The Iran crisis.
And what are the network's daily reminder of the crisis? The day-by-day countdowns.
Day 47.
The saturation coverage of the one-year anniversary on Election Eve 1980.
Good evening. November 4th, a day to remember. On this date in 1979, American citizens became hostages in Iran.
In the end, most believe, the same hostage crisis that helped Jimmy Carter fend off a primary challenge from Ted Kennedy hurt him badly in November.
I think at the end of the day, all that public attention on the plight of the hostages was good for nobody. It was not good for the hostages. It was certainly not good in the long run for Jimmy Carter's political fortunes. It was not really good when it comes down to the larger question of hostage-taking.
Did the media learn anything from this first hostage crisis? Observers are skeptical.
When the TWA 847 hostage crisis came along in 1985, all the guidelines that had been written and all the critiques that had been developed after the Iranian crisis were instantly forgotten, and putting competition and all sorts of other extraneous issues way ahead of what was in the best interest of the country, in the best interest of the hostages, in the best interest of anybody except perhaps TV ratings.
The Iran crisis demonstrated one of television's great strengths, the capacity to deliver powerful moving images from around the world in an instant. It also showed one of television's endemic weaknesses, the tendency to throw such images at us wrenched out of historical or political context. And ironically, one attempt to provide that missing context resulted in the birth of a new kind of news show, this one. I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
Continuing now our interview with former President Jimmy Carter. I know, Mr. President, how galling it must have been to you when we came on night after night, America Held Hostage, Day 44, Day 96, Day 126, when Walter Cronkite over on CBS would end each newscast by announcing the number of days that Americans have been held hostage. And I don't know whether it is possible. I know you try very hard to be an objective human being. Give me your assessment of the role that the media played, both good and bad.
Well, I know that I was relieved on occasion when the Ayatollah would exclude the Western media from the streets of Iran, because then the threats against the hostages would die down, the public demonstrations would die down. Absent television cameras, Iran became much more moderate in its attitude toward the crisis itself. And I think that although the evening news broadcast, including what later became Nightline, emphasized the concern about the hostages, it was a level of concern that I shared. It wasn't something that was stirred up by the news media that wouldn't otherwise have prevailed. That is, a concern about the hostages. I think, though, that on the other hand, instead of being just critical of the media, that worldwide attention focused on the hostages helped to protect their lives. Very shortly after the hostages were taken, I sent word to the Ayatollah by several means that if he put a hostage on trial, which he was threatening to do, that we would interrupt all commerce between Iran and the outside world. If he injured or killed a hostage, we would retaliate militarily. And so he was under that constraint. But I think that the world knowing that if a hostage died, it would be a very serious international conflict, likely, was a very restraining factor that protected the lives of our hostages and helped to bring every one of them back home safe and free.
We'll hear more from former President Carter a little later, but next, when we come back, a look at Iran today. Change in relations between the United States and Iran. But whatever may come in the future, this much is sure. Things can never again be what they once were. Bill Rediker reports from Tehran.
Before Iran's revolution, more than 100,000 Americans lived here, in Tehran, a virtual U.S. colony. But that was when the Shah ruled this oil-rich nation. The triumphant return from exile of the Ayatollah Khomeini changed all of that. America became identified with the Shah's corrupt and repressive regime. For student revolutionaries, the takeover of the U.S. Embassy was their storming of the Bastille.
Today, the embassy is a training school for the Revolutionary Guard. And officially, anti-Americanism remains the dominant theme in this country's foreign policy.
The sight of a foreign television news crew after Friday prayers still produces chants of death to America. Ibrahim Askerzadeh was in charge of the students holding American diplomats hostage in 1979. Now 34 years old, he is a member of the Iranian parliament.
The policy of the United States is still imperialist and is aimed at dominating this country. America will take any chance it gets to overthrow our revolution.
Askerzadeh says the American downing of an Iranian passenger jet in which 290 people were killed last year is proof of what he calls America's evil intentions towards Iran.
The shooting down of our plane proved to all Iranians that Americans are our enemies.
But not all Iranians toe the government line.
We like the people of the United States. Why not?
First of all, you must be honest and good in our relation, and after that we will talk about it.
But are Americans ready to talk to a state that many believe is linked to some of the most notorious acts of anti-American terror? Acts that most Americans believe were carried out by pro-Iranian groups bankrolled by Tehran. The images are indelible. But Iranians deny their country is involved directly or even indirectly.
Iran always gets accused of sponsoring terrorism around the world. What do you think of that accusation?
No, are you sure about
this is only...
It's just an accusation, sir. It's just an accusation. It's not, you are not sure about it.
So many Americans look at Iran and they only think of terrorism.
You see, that's not so. You can find terrorists everywhere.
But what about here?
You see, everywhere.
But there is no place quite like revolutionary Iran, where even 5 months after his death, the beliefs of Ayatollah Khomeini still dominate life here. To win Western confidence, Iran's new president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, knows Iran must lose its terrorist image. One way would be to resolve the issue of Western hostages held in Lebanon by the pro-Iranian radical Shiite group Hezbollah. Seen here on a recent visit to Tehran, Hezbollah leaders have had their funding from Iran cut in half. But Hezbollah also has powerful backers among Iranian hardliners like Ali Akbar Mohtashemi, so-called godfather of Hezbollah, who helped establish the group in the early 1980s and is Rafsanjani's most bitter political foe. At a recent news conference in Tehran, Rafsanjani said that relations with the United States were possible if America returns billions of dollars in Iranian assets frozen in banks after the takeover of the embassy. He also said the U.S. must help win the release of Iranians kidnapped by Christian militiamen in Lebanon. But there are also signs that Rafsanjani's room to maneuver is limited by his battle with the hardliners. To avoid giving them ammunition in a country that views Hezbollah as good Muslims, Rafsanjani still calls the group freedom fighters. So, with the political struggle still undecided, Rafsanjani has been unable to consolidate his power. 1 decade after the U.S. embassy was seized, America and Iran in November 1989 seem as far apart as ever. This is Bill Redeker for Nightline in Tehran.
When we come back, we'll hear from Jimmy Carter on what the U.S. might do to change that situation. The conclusion of our interview in a moment. And back once again with former President Carter. It's probably difficult, Mr. President, to think of another country in the world toward which Americans generally feel greater hostility, even today, 10 years after the fact, than Iran. How long do you think that is going to survive, and do you think we can ever get back to the point where the clear mutual interests that do exist between the United States and Iran can be allowed to prevail again?
Well, one thing that's most often forgotten is that from the time the Shah left until the hostages were taken, we were rebuilding good relationships with Iran, both politically and also economically. And I think that's a very strong possibility or likelihood in the future. I think leadership from the White House, from the State Department, could very quickly change the attitude of American people. Most would like to see some moderate leadership in Iran strengthened by our friendship and by commerce being restored, by economic benefits. It would be mutual. I am hoping that in the aftermath of the Ayatollah Khomeini's life, that Rafsanjani and others, maybe Yazdi and Bazargan, who were there before, those kinds of people can play a role that would let Iran demonstrate to our people in this country that they genuinely want restored and friendly relationships. One of the things that our government could do is to use present opportunities through intermediaries, if necessary, or perhaps even direct talks with Iran to get them to help with the release of the hostages. I don't know what the present policy is, but I know in the previous administration there was a prohibition against any kind of talks with Iran, or Iranian leaders or representatives, either directly or indirectly, to lead to this goal. So I am hopeful, and I expect that over a period of time we can restore the damaged relations, not completely, but set them on a road back toward normalcy.
Is it ever possible, Mr. President, and is it desirable from the U.S. point of view that the United States ever acknowledge that perhaps we made some mistakes, not after the hostage taking in 1979, but during that period of several decades preceding it, when the United States and Iran had a very, very close relationship, but where sometimes the people suffered because of it?
That would be hard to do, I think, not only because of the character of governments admitting fallibilities, but I don't believe that an objective analysis would show that the people suffered worse under the Shah than they did under the Ayatollah Khomeini. I think the abuses of human rights, the unnecessary killings, the devastation brought on the country, the war that was continued against Iraq, All these things were decisions made by the Ayatollah. I think they brought much more suffering, much more isolation, much more permanent damage to the Iranian people than did the policies of the Shah, although some of the policies of the Shah were not compatible with our own standards of what a democratic government ought to be.
When we come back, a look at some of the people we came to know during the hostage crisis and what's happened to them since. Immediately after the hostages were seized, the first American television correspondent to reach Tehran was Bob Dyke of ABC News. And because the Iranians suddenly stopped issuing visas for several days, Bob was the only American television correspondent in Tehran. We asked him to put together a piece for us on some of the other people you may remember from that time.
10 years ago at this time, I was standing outside the front gate of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran with anywhere from 800 to 1,000 demonstrators shouting "Death to America." Today, I'm still out in the open, but the streets are much quieter here in Portland, Maine, where I report for the ABC affiliate. As for the hostages who got a big welcome back in the winter of 1980, new realities lay beyond the ticker tape, and the lives of some of the key players have been changed or wiped out over the past 10 years. Iran's Foreign Minister Sadiq Gopsadeh, for example, was condemned by a revolutionary court in 1981 and shot as an alleged U.S. spy. As for the former hostages, I, and just about everyone else, reported back in 1979 that Embassy Press Attaché Barry Rosen was the man behind the blindfold. For the record, Rosen says this is Communications Officer Jerry Mealy, who retired from the State Department in 1984. As for the real Barry Rosen, these days he's in charge of public affairs at Brooklyn College. Former economics officer Moorhead Kennedy lectures and prepared this commercially available hostage crisis simulation, which gives young people a chance to experience firsthand the complicated issues involved in dealing with a similar situation. Former Chargé d'Affaires Bruce Langan retired from the Foreign Service a couple of years ago to become executive director of a nonprofit commission looking for ways to strengthen the services of government. But former Embassy Guard and Marine Sergeant William Gallegos is currently looking for work in Denver. And there were those who struggled on behalf of the U.S. to free Gallegos and the others. Former Deputy Secretary of State and Chief Negotiator Warren Christopher has left government to head up a law firm in Los Angeles.
I had been almost obsessed by this problem. I'd had some responsibility for selecting some of those who went to the embassy, and I, over the time, had begun to feel a very personal responsibility. So without making it too personal, I did feel an enormous sense of gratitude and relief.
Cyrus Vance, who resigned as Secretary of State following the aborted attempt to rescue the hostages, moved on to practice international law in New York. State Department spokesman Hodding Carter, who had the unwelcome daily task of briefing journalists on the crisis, has now become one on television. Which brings us to the man who spearheaded ABC's coverage of the crisis, Frank Reynolds. He was in the chair night after night, anchoring World News Tonight and the early editions of a nightly update called America Held Hostage, which gave birth to Nightline. Frank died in the summer of 1983. The man in the White House was, of course, Jimmy Carter. He spent his final days in the Oval Office, leading the hostage negotiations, and his final hours anxiously awaiting their release.
We now are engaged in a wide range of activities at the Carter Center involving human rights on a global scale, the termination of war through negotiation, humanitarian projects involving health and food production.
This is Bob Dyke for Nightline.
And that's our report for tonight. Our special thanks to former President Jimmy Carter for joining us. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Amana. This has been Nightline. If you wish a printed transcript of this or any Nightline broadcast, please send $3 to Nightline Transcripts, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. Or call area code 212-227-READ.
has been a presentation of ABC News, where more Americans get their news than from any other source.
Tomorrow,
somebody wants something from me.
One of America's all-time favorites.
Got all the bases covered so far.
Telly Savalas is back in an all-new Kojak.
It all stops here.
The season premiere of the ABC Saturday Mystery